Hello, everyone. This is the story of a gaming community that began with a handful of players, survived setbacks, overcame challenges, and grew into something larger than anyone expected. Over the next hour, we'll follow the journey from the earliest days of DoppleGang through the people, projects, and moments that helped shape the community into what it is today. Whether you're a longtime member, a returning player, or someone discovering DoppleGang for the very first time, thank you for joining us. If you enjoy the story, please consider liking the video, leaving a comment, and subscribing to follow future chapters as they are released. Part 1 tells the story of how DoppleGang came to be. Part 2 is already being written by the community every single day. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The man behind the tickets. Every community has a beginning. Most begin with excitement. Some begin with ambition. A few begin because people refuse to let something they care about disappear. This is one of those stories. Before there was a Discord called DoppleGang. Before there were servers. Before there were supporters, moderators, community bots, or future projects. There was simply a player, like thousands of others, logging into ARK, building bases, taming creatures, learning lessons the hard way, and somewhere along the journey, becoming the person others would turn to when they needed help. Most communities have people like that. The ones who answer questions, the ones who stay up later than they should, the ones who somehow end up helping solve problems that aren't even theirs. For many players, that person was power. Not because he owned anything, not because he demanded attention, not because he held the highest rank, but because he showed up again and again. When players lost tames, when things broke, when someone needed help understanding a mechanic, when a problem needed solving, people learned that if power was around, there was a good chance things would get sorted out. Trust rarely arrives all at once. It builds slowly, one interaction at a time, one favor at a time, one conversation at a time. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to trust someone completely. Trust is earned, usually without the person earning it even noticing. That seemed to be the case here. Long before DoppleGang existed, relationships were already forming. Friendships were already being built. People were learning who they could rely on. And while many players came and went, some names appeared again and again. People who would eventually become familiar throughout the story. People who would later help shape the community in ways nobody could yet predict. At the time, however, none of that seemed particularly important. It was just another gaming community. Another collection of players sharing a hobby. Another Discord server filled with conversations about breeding lines, base designs, map strategies, and whatever chaos ARK happened to create that day. Nobody was talking about founding new communities. Nobody was planning future projects. Nobody was imagining the road ahead. They were simply playing together, and that is often how the most important stories begin. Not with a grand plan, with ordinary people. Looking back, it is tempting to search for the moment everything changed. The turning point, the spark, the beginning of something larger. But real life rarely works that way. There is no dramatic music, no announcement telling everyone that history is about to happen. There are only small moments, moments that seem ordinary at the time. A conversation, a friendship, a favor, a choice. Only later do people realize those moments mattered. Power's story appears to have been built from hundreds of moments like that. Not one defining event, hundreds of small ones. Helping players, answering questions, giving up time that could have been spent elsewhere. Doing the sort of work that rarely earns recognition, but often earns respect. The funny thing about respect is that it cannot be demanded. It can only be given. and people seemed willing to give it, not because they were asked, because they believe it had been earned. As months passed, the community around him continued growing. New players arrived. Veterans stayed. Friendships deepened. Inside jokes formed. The sort of things that transform a group of strangers into a genuine community. Nobody knew where the journey would eventually lead. Nobody knew there would be challenges ahead. Nobody knew difficult choices were waiting around the corner. For now, things were simple. People played games. People helped each other. People laughed together. And among them was a player from Ireland who had quietly become someone others trusted. Not because he sought influence, not because he wanted recognition, but because he cared. At the time, that seemed like a small thing. It wasn't, because communities are not built from servers. They're not built from Discord channels. They're not built from logos or announcements. They're built from people. People willing to give their time. People willing to help. People willing to care. The story of DoppleGang would eventually involve servers, projects, communities, and ideas far larger than any one person. But every story has to start somewhere. This one starts with a player who kept showing up and a community that noticed. Chapter 2. The Night the Discord Exploded. Every community has a moment that people remember. Not always because it was planned. Not always because it was important at the time. Sometimes a moment becomes memorable simply because everyone who lived through it remembers exactly where they were when it happened. For many members of DoppleGang, that moment arrived on the night of October 1st, 2025. The night everything changed. Nobody had gathered expecting to start a new community. Nobody had logged in expecting to witness the beginning of something new. Most people were simply trying to understand what was happening. Messages started appearing. Questions followed. Then more questions. Players who had spent months, and in some cases years, playing together suddenly found themselves looking for answers. Confusion spread quickly. Rumors spread even faster. Nobody seemed to have the full picture. One person had heard one thing. Someone else had heard another. Screenshots began appearing. Conversations were shared. People compared notes. The situation changed by the minute. As more players arrived, the chat moved faster. Names began appearing that many people recognized. Veteran players, moderators, admins, friends, people who had spent countless hours together in game. Nobody seemed entirely sure what would happen next. What they did know was that something important had broken, and whenever something breaks, people start looking for the people they trust. The atmosphere that night was unlike anything most members had experienced before. It wasn't anger, not entirely. It wasn't sadness, not entirely. It felt more like uncertainty. The feeling that comes when a familiar place suddenly no longer feels familiar. The feeling of standing at a crossroads without knowing which path leads home. As the hours passed, more people arrived. Some came looking for information. Some came looking for friends. Some came simply because they didn't want to lose contact with the people they had spent so much time with. The Discord grew. Messages flew by faster than people could read them. Jokes appeared. Questions appeared. Concerns appeared. Some people tried to make sense of the situation. Others simply tried to keep spirits up. In the middle of all this chaos, something interesting began happening. People started choosing each other. Not servers, not maps, not infrastructure. People. Again and again, the conversation returned to the same thing. Wherever certain people went, others wanted to follow. Not because they were told to, because they trusted them. Trust is a strange thing. You rarely notice it while it's being built. only when it's tested. That night, it was being tested, and the results surprised even the people involved. Messages appeared offering support. People asked what would happen next. Others offered help. Some offered resources. Some offered time. Some simply offered encouragement. The details were still unclear. The future was uncertain. Yet the community itself seemed strangely determined. There was an energy in the conversations, a refusal to simply let everything fall apart. As the night continued, familiar personalities began emerging through the chaos. Dar was there. Brett was there. Gorbachev was there. Cookies, Stupid Bird, Glitterette, and countless others. Some were talking. Some were observing. Some were making jokes to keep morale high. Others were trying to understand the situation. Everyone experienced the night differently. Yet they all shared the same uncertainty. Nobody knew what tomorrow would look like. At one point, offers began appearing. Ideas, suggestions, possibilities. What if a new cluster was created? What if people built something together? What if this wasn't the end? At the time, those conversations felt almost impossible. Starting over sounded difficult, expensive, risky. Most communities never attempt it. Many that do fail. Yet the idea refused to disappear. The more people talked, the more the possibility began to feel real. A community that had gathered to discuss a problem slowly began discussing a future. Nobody could have predicted where those conversations would eventually lead. Nobody knew how many people would stay. Nobody knew how many challenges still lay ahead. They only knew one thing. They weren't ready to say goodbye. Looking back, it would be easy to focus on the drama, the disagreements, the uncertainty, the confusion. But that isn't what stands out most. What stands out is the people. People checking on each other. People sharing information. People offering help. People making sure nobody felt alone. The crisis that brought everyone together was important. The response was more important. Because while nobody realized it at the time, the foundations of DoppleGang were already being laid. Not through announcements, not through server launches, not through grand plans, through people choosing each other. The servers didn't exist yet. The structure didn't exist yet. The future didn't exist yet. But the community did. And before the night was over, something remarkable had happened. What began as uncertainty had become possibility. The questions hadn't been answered. The problems hadn't been solved. The road ahead was still hidden. Yet for the first time that night, people could see something beyond the chaos. Hope. And by morning, hope would become a plan. Chapter 3. The First Morning. The morning after a storm is always strange. The world looks familiar, yet somehow different. The night before had been filled with uncertainty. Questions had outnumbered answers. Nobody knew exactly what would happen next. Nobody knew how many people would stay. Nobody knew if the idea of building a new community was realistic. What they did know was that when they woke up the next day, the Discord was still alive. And so were the people inside it. The conversations had changed. The panic was gone. The confusion had eased. In its place was something far more powerful. Determination. The discussions were no longer centered around what had happened. They were centered around what came next. For the first time, people weren't looking backwards. They were looking forwards. That small shift changed everything. A community can survive uncertainty. What matters is what happens afterwards. Do people drift apart? Do they lose interest? Do they slowly disappear back into their own corners? Or do they start building? DoppleGang chose to build. The ideas started flowing almost immediately. Server plans, map selections, game settings, rules, infrastructure. Suggestions arrived from every direction. Some practical, some ambitious, some completely unrealistic. But nobody cared. For the first time in a long time, people felt like they were helping shape something that belonged to them. There was no corporate structure, no business plan, no investors, no guarantees, just a collection of players trying to create a place they wanted to spend their time. And somehow that was enough. The remarkable thing about those first few days was how quickly people started contributing. Not because they were asked to, because they wanted to. Some offered technical knowledge. Others offered advice. Some offered resources. Some simply offered their time. Each contribution was different. Each mattered. The community wasn't waiting for someone else to solve every problem. People were stepping forward and helping however they could. That spirit would become one of the defining traits of DoppleGang. If something needed doing, someone usually volunteered. If someone needed help, somebody usually answered. Not because they had to, because that was becoming the culture. Then came one of the first real signs that people believed in the project. Supporters began appearing. Names started showing up in donation channels. Players contributing toward maps. Servers. Infrastructure. The things needed to transform an idea into something people could actually play on. The amounts themselves weren't the important part. The belief was. At that stage, nothing had been proven. The servers weren't established. The community had no long history. There were no guarantees of success. Yet people were willing to support it anyway. That says more about a community than any announcement ever could. Trust had moved beyond words. It was becoming action. What makes those early contributions even more remarkable is that many of those names continued appearing long afterwards. Not as donors, as members, players, friends, people who stayed. The support wasn't a transaction. It was participation. Another topic appeared repeatedly during those early days. Transparency. People wanted something different. They wanted to understand how decisions were made, how support would be used, how the community would grow. The conversations weren't always formal. Sometimes they happened in passing. Sometimes they happened in public discussions. But the idea remained consistent. People wanted a community they could trust, not because someone demanded that trust, because it was earned openly. That expectation would quietly shape many of the decisions that followed. As plans continued forming, excitement started replacing uncertainty. Maps were discussed. Future possibilities were imagined. People talked about what they hoped the community might become. Some dreamed big. Others stayed cautious. Most landed somewhere in the middle. Nobody could predict the future. But for the first time, people were allowing themselves to imagine one. That mattered, because communities are built twice. First in imagination, then in reality. Before a server can exist, somebody has to believe it can exist. Before a community can grow, somebody has to imagine what it might become. The first morning was filled with those moments. Small conversations, simple ideas. None of them seemed historic. Most were forgotten almost as quickly as they appeared. Yet together they created momentum. And momentum is a powerful thing. The previous night had been about uncertainty. This day was about possibility. The road ahead remained unclear. There would be setbacks, challenges, unexpected problems, more work than anyone anticipated. But nobody was thinking much about that yet. They were too busy building. The community had taken its first step, not because everything was ready, because people had decided it was worth trying. And sometimes that's all a beginning really needs. Chapter 4. The First Test. Every new community dreams about growth. New members, new servers, new possibilities. Few spend much time thinking about what happens when things go wrong. At first, DoppleGang's future seemed straightforward. The community had survived the uncertainty. Players were arriving. Supporters were stepping forward. Servers were coming online. The difficult part appeared to be over. In reality, it was only beginning. Because building a community and running a gaming network are two very different things. One is built on people. The other is built on infrastructure. And infrastructure has a habit of reminding everyone that it does not care about enthusiasm. The first signs were easy to miss. A transfer that didn't work correctly. A player reporting an issue. A strange error. A server behaving unexpectedly. Nothing unusual on its own. Any experienced administrator knows that small issues happen, especially during launch periods. The expectation was simple. Find a cause. Fix the problem. Move on. But the problems didn't disappear. They returned. Again and again. As October continued, staff found themselves spending increasing amounts of time investigating issues that refused to make sense. Player transfers were behaving unpredictably. Systems that should have been working weren't. Solutions that normally fix similar problems had little effect. The more they searched, the stranger things became. Every path seemed to lead back to the same place. The hosting environment itself. At first, nobody wanted to believe that. Technical troubleshooting usually starts by looking inward. Check the settings. Check the configuration. Check the permissions. Check the servers. Check everything. Then check it all again. The staff did exactly that. They searched for mistakes. They searched for misconfigurations. They searched for anything they might have overlooked. Yet every road appeared to lead back to the same conclusion. The issue wasn't inside DoppleGang. The issue appeared to be underneath it. The nodes themselves. That realization created a different kind of challenge. Problems inside a community can usually be solved by the community. Problems outside it are far more difficult. You cannot fix infrastructure you do not control. You cannot rewrite systems owned by someone else. You can only investigate, report, test, wait, then test again. For players, the experience was frustrating. For staff, it was exhausting. Hours disappeared into troubleshooting sessions. Logs were examined. Settings were compared. Theories were tested. Some possibilities looked promising. Others fell apart almost immediately. The work continued regardless. Because giving up was never really an option. The community was growing. People were investing their time, their energy, their trust. The problems needed answers. Yet answers remained frustratingly out of reach. As the weeks passed, the effects became noticeable. Not everyone stayed. Some players grew tired of the issues. Others decided to wait for things to improve. A few quietly moved on. That happens in every community, especially when technical difficulties begin affecting the experience. The surprising part was not that some people left. The surprising part was how many stayed, even when the servers struggled, even when transfers caused headaches, even when frustrations grew. Many members continued believing in the vision being built around them. Not because everything was working perfectly, because they could see the effort. They could see people trying. Every bug report, every troubleshooting session, every update, every attempt to find solution. The community knew the problems were real. They also knew people were working tirelessly to solve them. That matters more than many realize. Perfection builds expectations. Effort builds trust. During those difficult months, trust became one of DoppleGang's most valuable resources. Far more valuable than hardware. Far more valuable than hosting. Far more valuable than server slots. Because trust gave people a reason to stay while solutions were still being found. And while some members left, new members continued arriving. Some joined during the excitement of launch. Others arrived right in the middle of the difficulties. They didn't see a perfect community. They saw a determined one. A community that refused to stop moving forward. A community that kept building despite the obstacles. A community that believed the destination was worth the journey. The problems eventually became part of daily life. Not because they were accepted, because people learned to work through them. Staff continued searching for answers. Players continued supporting one another. The community continued growing. Slowly, steadily, one step at a time. Looking back, those months revealed something important. The split had created DoppleGang. The difficulties tested it. Anyone can believe in a project when everything is working. The real question is what happens when things are not. October and November provided that answer. The servers struggled. The community didn't. And when the dust finally began to settle, something unexpected became clear. DoppleGang was no longer being held together by excitement. It was being held together by commitment. The honeymoon period was over. The real journey had begun. Chapter 5: A Better Foundation. Every community reaches a moment where belief alone is no longer enough. The excitement of a new beginning can carry people only so far. Eventually, reality asks a simple question. Can this actually work? For DoppleGang, that question had followed the community throughout October and November. The vision was there. The people were there. The support was there. What remained uncertain was the foundation beneath it all. The technical issues had become impossible to ignore. Transfers failed when they shouldn't. Problems appeared without obvious explanations. Hours of troubleshooting often produced more questions than answers. Again and again, investigations seemed to point toward the same conclusion. The problem was not the community. The problem was the infrastructure supporting it. For those working behind the scenes, the frustration was immense. Nobody wants to tell players that a problem still isn't solved. Nobody wants to spend night after night chasing answers that refuse to appear. Yet, that was the reality facing the staff. The community remained patient. But patience is not infinite. Something had to change, and eventually it did. In early December, members began noticing unusual announcements. References to testing. Mentions of new hardware. Warnings not to join unfamiliar servers appearing in the server browser. At first, details were limited. Only those working directly on the project knew the full picture. Everyone else simply waited. Then came the announcement. The entire cluster was moving. Not to another shared environment. Not to another temporary solution. To a brand new private premium machine. It was a massive step. The kind of decision that carried risk. The kind of decision that required commitment. The kind of decision that signaled confidence in the future. For many members, the announcement represented more than hardware. It represented progress. After months of struggling against limitations that seemed beyond anyone's control, DoppleGang was finally building on ground that felt stable. The move wasn't perfect. No major migration ever is. One PvP map was lost during the process and had to be restarted completely. Nobody celebrated that reality. It was disappointing, frustrating, unavoidable. Yet, even in delivering bad news, The response reflected the values that had been emerging throughout the community. Players affected by losses were offered help where possible. Logs could be checked. Cases could be reviewed. Support would be provided. Not because anyone was obligated to do so, because people mattered. The migration itself marked a turning point. For the first time, conversations began shifting away from survival, away from troubleshooting, away from trying to identify the next technical issue. Instead, people began talking about possibilities, future growth, future maps, future projects. The horizon suddenly felt larger. What made the moment remarkable wasn't the machine. Most players would never see it. Most wouldn't understand the specifications. Most wouldn't care. What they cared about was what it represented. Stability, reliability, a future. The difficult months had tested the community. Some people had left. Many had stayed. And now those who stayed could finally see the results of that patience. The servers were stronger. The foundation was stronger. The community was stronger. Looking back, this was the moment DoppleGang stopped feeling temporary. Until then, many people had been asking themselves whether the project would succeed, whether it would survive, whether it would last. After December, a different question began emerging. Not whether it would survive, but what it might become. The first chapters of the story had been about trust, then uncertainty, then perseverance. Now, for the first time, there was something solid beneath everyone's feet. A better foundation. And from that foundation, bigger things would soon begin to grow. Chapter 6. More than servers. By the end of December, something had changed. The technical problems that had dominated so many conversations were beginning to fade into the background. The new hardware was online. The community was stabilizing. The future finally felt a little less uncertain. For the first time since the beginning, people had the opportunity to focus on something other than simply keeping the servers running. They could focus on the community itself. Looking back, it would be easy to assume that DoppleGang was always destined to become what it eventually became. It wasn't. At every stage of its journey, it could have gone in countless different directions. Some gaming communities become highly competitive. Others become heavily administrative. Some slowly transform into businesses. Others disappear entirely. DoppleGang seemed to be searching for something different. Not just a place to play, a place to belong. The signs appeared gradually. A conversation that had nothing to do with ARK. A joke that lasted longer than the game that inspired it. Members discussing their lives outside of gaming. Stories about families, work, children, holidays, dreams, struggles. Ordinary moments shared between people who happened to meet because of dinosaurs and survival mechanics. The longer the community existed, the more obvious it became that the servers were only part of the story. People weren't logging in because they needed another server. There were already thousands of servers available. People were staying because of the people. That distinction mattered. Servers can be replaced. Communities cannot. As new members arrived, they entered a place that was already beginning to develop its own personality. Not through rules, through culture, humor, friendship, shared experiences. The little things that cannot be configured inside a control panel. One member might spend an evening helping a stranger recover from a difficult situation. Another might stay awake far too late answering questions. Someone else might spend hours making another person laugh. None of it appeared important in isolation. Together, it became the foundation of the community. What made DoppleGang unusual was that many of the people helping build it were not trying to build anything at all. They were simply being themselves. That authenticity became one of the community's greatest strengths. Members could sense it. The place felt different. Less polished, perhaps. Less corporate. Less concerned with appearances. But more genuine. And genuine communities are surprisingly rare. By now, former players from other places had started arriving. Some came cautiously. Some arrived carrying baggage from previous experiences. Others simply wanted somewhere stable to play. The welcome they received revealed something important. DoppleGang wasn't interested in recreating the past. It was interested in creating a future. People were encouraged to start fresh, to enjoy the game again, to become part of something new. The emphasis was not on what had been lost. It was on what could still be built. That attitude quietly shaped the months that followed. Every community eventually develops a reputation, not the one it chooses for itself, the one its members create through their actions. DoppleGang's reputation was still being written, yet the themes were already becoming clear. Help when possible. Be honest when you cannot. Treat people fairly. Keep moving forward. Simple ideas. Difficult to maintain. Yet somehow the community kept finding its way back to them. The servers were important. Nobody denied that. Without them, there would be no place to play. But by the end of December, something had become increasingly obvious. DoppleGang was becoming more than servers, more than maps, more than game settings. It was becoming a community in the truest sense of the word. Not because someone declared it, because people chose it, again and again, day after day, conversation after conversation, choice after choice. The infrastructure had finally been stabilized. Now, something far more important was beginning to grow. A culture. And unlike hardware, culture cannot be purchased. It must be earned, one person at a time. Chapter 7. Beyond Survival. Success creates a problem few people talk about. When you spent months solving emergencies, what happens when the emergencies disappear? By the beginning of 2026, DoppleGang was in unfamiliar territory. The servers were running smoothly. Player complaints had become rare. The endless troubleshooting that had dominated October and November was largely gone. For the first time since the community began, things were simply working. That might sound unremarkable. In reality, it was one of the most important milestones DoppleGang had reached. The staff noticed it first. Tickets still appeared. Players still needed help. Questions still needed answers. Yet something had changed. Many of the tickets being created were no longer reports of major problems. They were routine requests, bot deliveries, general support, everyday community interactions. The sort of tickets administrators dream about seeing. The cluster had reached a point where people were spending more time playing than troubleshooting. Months earlier, that would have seemed impossible. Now it was becoming normal. With stability came something else. Time. The people who had spent countless hours chasing technical issues suddenly found themselves with the freedom to explore new ideas. And ideas began appearing everywhere. Some focused on expanding existing systems. Others focused on entirely new games. Palworld entered the conversation. 7 Days to Die appeared. Minecraft was explored. Hytale remained an exciting possibility on the horizon. Some projects succeeded. Others quietly faded away. Not every experiment needed to become permanent. The important thing was that the community was experimenting at all. For the first time, DoppleGang wasn't just maintaining itself. It was imagining its future. The shift became visible on January 27th. After several unusually quiet days, Power posted a message explaining his absence. Not because there was a problem, because he had been helping develop a Discord bot similar to DoppBot, a tool designed not only for DoppleGang, but potentially for other communities as well. The announcement carried a message that would become increasingly important: sustainability. The goal wasn't expansion for the sake of expansion. The goal was creating systems that could help support DoppleGang itself, reducing costs, creating stability, building something that might keep the community alive long into the future. For many members, it was the first sign that some of the skills developed while building DoppleGang could have applications beyond a single ARK cluster. The community had started with servers, then came infrastructure, then came culture, now came creation. Nobody knew exactly where these projects would lead. Most people probably weren't thinking that far ahead. They simply saw people building, creating, experimenting, trying new things. The same mindset that had carried DoppleGang through its difficult beginnings was now being applied to something entirely different. Possibility. The community was no longer asking how to survive. It was beginning to ask what it could become. And somewhere among those conversations, projects, and experiments, the first hints of something larger began appearing. At the time, they were easy to miss. A new idea, a new logo, a new project, a new name. Most people paid little attention, but the seeds of the next chapter had already been planted. Chapter 8: The People Between the Lines. Every community has a story. Most people assume that story is written by founders, administrators, or major events. They're only partly right. The truth is that communities are often shaped just as much by the people between the headlines. The people who log in every day, the people who answer questions, the people who make others laugh, the people who somehow become part of the furniture without anyone noticing exactly when it happened. By 2026, DoppleGang had become filled with those people. Some had been there from the beginning. Others arrived later. Yet all of them helped shape the personality of the community in their own way. Yaramos had developed a reputation for appearing exactly when needed. If a conversation lasted long enough, there was a good chance Yaramos would eventually arrive with advice, a suggestion, or an offer to help. Sometimes all three, whether discussing game mechanics, solving problems, or simply joining the conversation. He had become one of those familiar voices that seemed woven into everyday community life. Then there was sacrifice. Some people became known for their knowledge. Others became known for their humor. A few became known because no matter what was happening around them, they somehow still found time to help. Sacrifice was one of those people. Whether someone needed advice, assistance, or simply another pair of eyes on a problem, there was a good chance she would jump in. What made it memorable was that she often seemed to be fighting her own battles at the same time. There were occasions when she appeared to be simultaneously lost, in trouble, and at least a little drunk, yet somehow still managed to answer questions and help other players solve their problems. Nobody was entirely sure how she pulled it off, but it became part of her charm. If you needed help, Sacrifice would probably try. Whether or not she was currently surviving her own adventure was an entirely separate question. Brett occupied a different corner of the community. Officially, he was a Discord moderator. In practice, Brett seemed to exist wherever something interesting was happening. Sometimes that meant helping with projects. Sometimes it meant discussing game mechanics. Sometimes it meant finding himself in a voice channel with Sacrifice at questionable hours. Both of them farming coins while conversations drifted in directions nobody could have predicted. According to community folklore, Brett didn't even need to drink to get involved in the chaos. The smell of alcohol seemed to be enough. How much of that was true depended entirely on who was telling the story. Either way, if there was laughter coming from a voice channel, there was a reasonable chance Brett had found his way into it. Kevin had earned a nickname that many members knew just as well as his actual name. To some, he was GTR Kevin. To others, he was simply Shard. More importantly, Kevin had become an accidental benchmark for the health of the servers themselves. During the difficult months, transfer issues had frustrated players across the cluster. Now Kevin was moving between maps so often that his daily routine became proof that those problems had largely disappeared. If Kevin had transferred 6 times before lunch and everything was still working, the cluster was probably healthy. Gunnar represented another type of community member. Not everyone becomes known through constant conversation. Some become known simply through presence. While he remained relatively quiet in Discord, Gunnar had become a familiar figure in game. Some names become familiar because they talk. Others become familiar because they're always around. Gunnar belonged firmly in the second group. Then there was Cookies. By this point, explaining the ongoing feet picture jokes that occasionally swept through the community would have been nearly impossible. Nobody seemed entirely sure how it started. Nobody appeared particularly interested in stopping it. Cookies had become one of the names most commonly associated with the running joke. Like many traditions in online communities, it made very little sense from the outside, which probably explained why it survived. Axis remained something of a mystery. At any given moment, there was a reasonable chance someone would suggest he was relaxing in a hot tub somewhere. Whether this was true, exaggerated, or completely fabricated had long since stopped mattering. The joke had become part of the character, and every community needs a few characters. Glitterette was another. Many believed she should have been streaming. The amount of effort she invested into breeding projects certainly suggested she would have had an audience. Instead, she could often be found deep in Valguero, juggling bloodlines, mutations, and breeding plans that would have made most players dizzy. It was the sort of dedication that probably deserved its own documentary. Stupid Bird had achieved something even rarer. He had become a constant. Always online. Always available. Always helping. If someone had a question, there was a good chance Stupid Bird already knew the answer. If somebody needed assistance, there was a good chance he was already on his way. He also maintained what he described as a perfectly legitimate community center. Rumors regarding certain suspiciously powerful dinosaurs remained entirely unconfirmed, at least officially. Speckles arrived later than many of the names already woven into the community story. Yet somehow it felt as though she had always been there. Always chatting. Always playing. Always helping. Always present. Members tagged her regularly, often accompanied by the same ridiculous foot gif jokes that seemed to follow many of the community's most active members. It was less an initiation and more a sign that she had become part of the family. Then there was Volturos. Life had eventually pulled him away from the daily routines of the community. That happens. Every long-running community learns that reality always comes first. Yet his management position remained open, not because of policy, not because of necessity, because of respect. The community had not forgotten what he contributed, and if one day he chose to return, his place would still be waiting. Looking around DoppleGang in 2026, it became increasingly difficult to identify a single person responsible for its success. The founders had built the foundations. The administrators kept the games running. The moderators helped keep order. But the personality of the community came from somewhere else. It came from the people between the lines, the names that appeared in conversations, The voices that filled voice chats. The players who showed up day after day without needing a title. The people who transformed a collection of servers into something that felt alive. And perhaps that was the clearest sign yet of how far DoppleGang had come. The story was no longer about a few individuals. It had become a story about all of them. Chapter 9. Building more than servers. For a long time, success in DoppleGang had been measured by stability. Were the servers online? Were transfers working? Were players happy? After everything the community had experienced during its first months, those questions mattered. But eventually something interesting happened. The problems stopped arriving. At least, not in the same numbers. The emergency tickets became rare. The late-night troubleshooting sessions became less common. The endless hunt for technical issues that had consumed so much time during the early days slowly faded into the background. For the first time since the community began, the people responsible for keeping everything running found themselves with something they had not had much of before: time. It turned out that when administrators weren't spending every spare moment solving problems, they started creating things. New ideas appeared. New projects emerged. New possibilities were explored. Some worked. Some didn't. That was part of the process. What mattered was that the community was no longer focused solely on maintaining what existed. It was beginning to build something larger. One of the clearest examples was DoppleBot. Most members simply saw it as part of daily life. It delivered rewards, helped players, supported community systems, made life easier. It was friendly, familiar, a tool people interacted with regularly. For many members, DoppleBot became as much a part of the community as any channel or role. Yet DoppleBot was only part of the story. Behind the scenes, another system was quietly doing its job. Most players never noticed it. That was the point. Known as DoppleGang, the system spent its time watching over the cluster, logging activity, monitoring events, tracking issues, reporting unusual behavior, alerting staff when something needed attention. While players explored maps, bred creatures, built bases, or chased their next goal, DoppleGang remained awake. Always watching, always recording, always ready to raise the alarm. The majority of players would never realize how much protection systems like that provided. And that was perfectly fine. The best safety systems are often the ones nobody notices. Then there was DoppleGang. Unlike DoppleGang, its purpose was obvious. DoppleGang existed because communities need more than administration. They need fun, coin systems, games, activities, reasons to spend time together even when nobody was actively playing. It transformed quiet moments into competitions, voice chats into entertainment, ordinary evenings into something memorable. The system became another small thread helping connect people together. Taken individually, none of these projects seemed revolutionary. Taken together, they revealed something important. DoppleGang was no longer just hosting games. It was creating its own tools, its own systems, its own solutions. The same mindset that had solved server problems was now being directed elsewhere. If something useful didn't exist, perhaps it could be built. If a problem appeared often enough, perhaps it could be automated. If players needed something, perhaps there was a better way to provide it. That philosophy began spreading beyond ARK. Palworld gained momentum. New ideas appeared around other games. 7 Days to Die was explored. Minecraft entered discussions. Hytale remained an exciting possibility waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. Not every experiment succeeded. Not every project survived. Success wasn't measured by whether every idea worked. Success was measured by whether people were willing to try. And they were. Looking back, this period marked another turning point in the story. The community had already proven it could survive. It had proven it could grow. Now, it was proving something else. It could create, not because it had to, because it wanted to. Somewhere during this period, members began noticing small signs that ideas were beginning to stretch beyond the boundaries of a single game. A logo here, a project there, a name appearing more frequently than before. Most paid little attention. Communities are always full of ideas. Most disappear as quickly as they arrive. Yet some ideas refuse to fade away. Instead, they keep reappearing, growing a little larger each time. At the time, few people realized it, but the seeds of the next chapter had already been planted, and they would soon begin appearing in places nobody expected. Chapter 10, Still Being Written. Every story reaches a point where the historian must put down the pen. Not because the story is finished, because the story has caught up to the present. By now, DoppleGang is no longer an idea. It is no longer a project trying to prove itself. It is no longer simply a response to events that happen elsewhere. It has become its own community. Players continue to log in every day. Some spend a few hours. Others spend hundreds each month. Friendships continue to grow. New members continue to arrive. Veterans continue to return. The servers remain active. The Discord remains alive. The conversations never truly stop. Management continues guiding the community. Administrators continue supporting their games. Moderators continue helping wherever needed. The regulars continue doing what they've always done. Helping, laughing, building, creating stories worth telling. Somewhere tonight, Yarmos is probably helping somebody. Sacrifice is likely solving someone else's problem while creating a new one for herself. Brett has probably wandered into a voice channel he had no intention of joining and somehow become part of the chaos. GT Kevin is transferring between maps often enough to prove the servers are still healthy. Glitterette is almost certainly breeding something. Stupid Bird is online. Axis may or may not be a hot tub. And the community continues doing what it has always done best. Showing up. The projects continue evolving. DOP Bot continues helping players. DOP Circom continues quietly protecting the cluster. DOP Games continues giving people something to do when they should probably be sleeping. New ideas continue appearing. New games continue being explored. Some experiments succeed. Others don't. That's how growth works. Most importantly, the philosophy that helped build DoppleGang remains unchanged. The community remains free to play. Support is appreciated. Always has been. Always will be. But nobody is required to pay to belong. The story was never built on donations. It was built on people. People who chose to stay. People who chose to help. People who chose to become part of something bigger than themselves. And that brings us to today. Not the end. Simply the point where this history catches up to the present. The future of DoppleGang remains unwritten. The next chapter is already being created. The next stories are already happening. The next memories are already being made. Perhaps one day there will be a part 2. Perhaps the story will become larger than any of us imagined. Only time will tell. Until then, thank you for being part of the journey. And if you've enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and subscribe. Part 2 is already being written as we speak. If you'd like to become part of the story yourself, there's still time. After all, the best chapters haven't happened yet.